Chapter 781. The sound of the cool motorcycle rumbling on the road rang through the sky. The cool autumn wind blew on her face and her long hair fluttered. Just like that, Old Can led her forward, not saying where they were going. More than an hour later, they arrived at the beach. Old Can stopped the motorcycle and combed his messy curly hair. "Little girl, are you feeling better now?" Pei Chi supported him and jumped off the motorcycle. Looking at the blue sea, she moaned a few times. Walking beside her, Lao Can stretched his body and took out a cigarette to smoke. He asked with some ill intentions, "This gigolo is also your past?" "Pei Chi, you're really lucky. The two gigolos look like elites." Of course, Tang Yu was naturally more charismatic. Pei Chi took a few steps forward and walked to a place with sunlight. She took off her shoes and sat on the beach. Hugging her knees, she looked at the blue sea and smiled. "He's Tang Yu's cousin." Pei Chi looked sideways at Old Kansas. "I liked him when I was in college." Later. Although she was smiling, there was bitterness in her eyes. "Later, I sold myself to Tang Yu." Old Can sat beside her and patted her little head. "Have you changed your mind?" "What a sudden change." Pei Chi was stunned and then smiled. "You can say that." Old Can patted her again. "Who hasn't loved a few scumbags? Little girl, now that you've met a great man, you must cherish him." "You?" Pei Chi smiled. Old Can took out a wrinkled cigarette from his pocket and straightened it with his hand. He took a puff and looked at her. "Why? Can't I?" "You're too old." Pei Chi punched him. Then she put down her shoes, rolled up her jeans and started running on the beach. She ran like a little lunatic. She didn't care if her hair was messy or her clothes were dirty. She put her palms together and shouted at the endless sea, "It's nothing. Pei Chi, it's nothing." She called him several times in a row, then turned around and looked at Old Can excitedly. "Am I right?" Old Can smiled, got up and patted the sand off his body. He walked to her side and shouted at the sea, "Yes. Pei Chi, it's nothing. If that doesn't work, you still have that spare tire that used 4TS. Pei Chi glared at him. "Old Can, you really know how to spoil the mood." Old Can laughed and handed her shoes to her. "Put them on. Go fill your stomach, I'll take you to do some private work in the afternoon." Pei Chi put on her shoes with one hand and punched Lao Can with the other. "I knew Master wouldn't let me down." Holding her with one hand, Lao Can teased his disciple, "Pei Chi, you said I'm old just now. Why don't we have a try?" Pei Chi pursed her lips and smiled. "There's no need, Master. You should save your energy for our clients. Your master sells his skills, not his body." Old Can pinched her little face and got into the car himself, letting her sit in the back. After fooling around outside for the whole afternoon, they were scolded when they got back because they didn't see anyone to interview. The managing editor held a cigarette in his mouth and said in a muffled voice, "Anyway, you must finish the manuscript this week. We need to use it. Also, Xingyuan's secretariat called and said they want you to interview and take photos alone." Chapter 782. Pei Chi subconsciously refused. "That doesn't make sense. I believe you can do it." The chief editor's tone softened again. "The establishment of our branch requires performance, and we need to make performance that satisfies the higher-ups. What do we lack? Something that will make people's eyes shine." Pei Chi looked at the chief editor suspiciously. "What else do you need me to do besides the interview?" The chief editor took the cigarette butt out of his mouth and smiled. "Chi, the sales of the last issue were very good. The higher-ups are very optimistic about us. If we can create a sales legend this issue, our status in the industry will be further improved." Xiao Pei, Man magazine has been selling very well recently, and the higher-ups are giving us a lot of pressure. Pei Chichi said slowly, isn't Man magazine under Jean Taihe? The chief editor's eyes widened, you know that too. Pei Chichi said casually, I heard it from Lao Kansas. Oh, I asked Lao Kan to do something else. He's going abroad this week, so he won't be in B City. The chief editor was cunning. Pei Chichi knew that the chief editor did it on purpose. She smiled and didn't say anything else. The next day, she made an appointment with Xiao Ran and went to Xingyuan alone with her camera. This time, she went to the reception room on the top floor very smoothly, and Xiao Ran arranged for her to wait there. I'll go and report to the president. Pei Chichi nodded. Because she was separated from Tang Yu, even if she was very familiar with Xiao Ran, she pretended not to be. She tried to reduce her interaction with Tang Yu as much as possible. Especially after this interview, she didn't want to have any contact with him anymore. Xiao Ran brought a cup of coffee first, and then went to Tang Yu's office, where he was concentrating on flipping through the files. His formal attire looked impeccable and noble. Xiao Ran knocked on the door. President, Miss Pei is here. Tang Yu's fingers paused for a moment as he watched the golden pen draw a long line on the paper. After a while, he said, let her wait for half an hour. Xiao Ran nodded. However, after she went to the reception room to deliver the message, Pei Chichi stood up and smiled faintly. If Mr. Tang is very busy, then I won't bother you anymore. Let's make an appointment next time. She left without hesitation, leaving behind a dumbfounded Xiao Ran. Xiao Ran had always been calm and collected, and it was rare for her to make a mistake. However, Pei Chichi's unexpected move caught her off guard. In the blink of an eye, Pei Chichi had already walked to the elevator. She straightened her bag while waiting for the elevator. Just as the elevator door opened, before she could enter, a large palm grabbed her arm from outside. Don't you want an interview? Tang Yu's deep voice sounded. Pei Chichi got rid of his hand and turned around with a professional smile on her face. Mr. Tang. Compared to her indifference, his expression wasn't good. It could even be said that he was a little angry. Tang Yu stood straight and pursed his lips into a straight line. Didn't Miss Pei say that she wanted an interview? Mr. Tang also said that he didn't have time for now. Pei Chichi looked at him sideways, her face full of provocation. Xiao Ran, who had followed behind, heard this and left first. Tang Yu looked at Pei Chichi, and she also looked into his unfathomable eyes. After a while, he walked to the reception room and said indifferently, Aren't you coming in? Chapter 783. This was a small meeting room. It was about 20 square meters and was rarely used. But it was very private. Once the door was closed, it would be useless even if one shouted until their throat was hoarse. Tang Yu was wearing a coffee-colored, three-piece suit today. It was very formal and made his face look even more handsome. He sat on the sofa and motioned for her to sit down. Xiao Ran delivered the coffee just in time. She glanced around the room before swiftly leaving. Tang Yu's eyes fell in the direction of the door. After a while, he returned to Pei Chichi's little face and said lightly, Miss Pei, can we start? Pei Chichi was supposed to do business, but now that he was so cooperative, her unreasonable request was actually a little difficult to say. He probably wouldn't agree to let a person like Tang Yu appear on the cover of a women's weekly magazine. But she had to convince him. She pursed her lips and said in a low voice, There is a contract here. Mr. Tang, take a look first. Pei Chichi pushed a thin piece of paper in front of Tang Yu. Tang Yu picked it up and looked at it. It asked for his photo to be on the cover of Beauty magazine. The reward was 100,000 yuan. He put down the paper in his hand and leaned on the sofa. He looked at Pei Chichi with burning eyes. 100,000 yuan. Pei Chi blushed for the editor-in-chief, but she still kept a straight face. Yes. Mr. Tang, you can think about it. There's no need to think about it. I won't agree. Tang Yu's tone was a little indifferent. I think Miss Pei also knows that as the leader of a company, you can't just show your face in public like this. The interview is already the limit. Pei Chi wanted to throw the draft in her hand at his face and sneer at him. Then don't do the interview. But when she thought of the editor-in-chief and Lao Can's position in the magazine, she still tried to persuade him. This is very good for Xing Yuan's publicity. Our magazine's sales are very good. Tang Yu's body stretched out. Watching her little mouth move, her whole person also became much more lively. He picked up the coffee and took a sip. It was as if a drop of water had seeped into his exhausted soul. He felt much more comfortable. Slowly, Tang Yu said, Pei Chi, most of your magazine readers are female, right? Pei Chi nodded, trying to look professional. Tang Yu's eyes calmly fell on her little face, and he smiled slightly. Pei Chi, do you think I need to sell my body? Pei Chi was stumped by the question and did not answer for a long time. Tang Yu smiled again, holding the piece of paper. You can, but Pei Chi's eyes were a little guarded as she looked at him cautiously. Tang Yu looked down, and there was a hint of a sigh in his voice. Chi, Dad has aged a lot in the past year. He misses you very much. If you're free, go back and see him. For this reason, the author gives Mr. Tang full marks and despises him. After saying that, to Pei Chi's surprise, he signed the contract and handed it back to her. It's done. Let's start. Pei Chi looked as if she was in a dream. She looked at him for a long time before putting the piece of paper away. Tang Yu sat up straight. Pei Chi took out the draft in a hurry. She raised her head slightly and looked at his handsome face. Suddenly, she felt that her lips were a little dry, and she licked them. She also despised herself in her heart. Pei Chi, he is your brother. Chapter 784. She didn't know what Tang Yu was thinking or how he felt about that forbidden love, but she didn't dare to think about it because it made her feel sinful. She felt even more sorry for that child. She was a little confused, so her words were a little incoherent when she asked. Tang Yu interrupted her, his voice a little cold. Miss Pei, if you haven't adjusted your emotions, then let's pause for a while. She stopped abruptly and looked at him, a little confused. Tang Yu got up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. His posture was impeccable, but it was tense. Pei Chi pursed her lips and looked at his back view. The room was eerily quiet. After a long time of silence, he turned to look at her. Miss Pei, are you done? Pei Chi didn't move. She looked straight into his eyes and said in a mechanical voice, I'm done. Where's Mr. Tang? He didn't answer but walked over and sat down again. His every movement was elegant and graceful. However, she didn't know that he was deliberately seducing her. Pei Chi pursed her dry lips. She took the press release and adjusted her facial expression. She smiled and asked, Did Mr. Tang have a difficult time when he took over Xing Yuan? Tang Yu's gaze was a little deep. After a long time, he asked softly, Do you want to know? Pei Chi said quickly, It's the readers who want to know. He looked at her deeply for a long time before saying, There were definitely difficulties, but it wasn't as difficult as you think. After all, when I took over, my parents had already run Xing Yuan very successfully. He shared a few small crises, but of course, they were insignificant ones. Pei Chi wrote them down, then she asked some official questions. These were all press releases from the news department, and they were the content that everyone would ask when they interviewed someone. Pei Chi was almost done asking. She looked at the last two lines and didn't speak for a long time. She looked a little stunned. Miss Pei. Tang Yu's voice sounded faintly. Why aren't you saying anything? Pei Chi looked at the words on the piece of paper and pursed her lips. After a long time, she said softly, when are Mr. Tang and Miss Shen getting married? With that, she looked up at him. She told herself not to cry. Because it wasn't worth it. Without the child, they were strangers to each other. That trace of bloodline also seemed so ironic. However, her eyes were still warm. No matter how strong she was still hurt at this moment. The wound tore open again. It was as if a handful of salt had been sprinkled on it, causing pain. Tang Yu looked at her and saw her forbearing expression. He sighed in his heart. But his face was impeccable. He gave her a very official answer. Not at the moment. Pei Chi-Chi's gaze was still on his face, and he did not avoid it. They gazed at each other for a long time. All right. I see. Let's move on to the next question. She finally came back to her senses and started talking nonsense. But what question was there? She had already asked the last question. Looking at the paper, she went into a daze for a while before she looked up and smiled. Mr. Tang, that's all. She put another layer of protection over herself. Tang Yu also smiled. He raised his hand to look at his watch. It's getting late. Let's have dinner together. Chapter 785. What about in private? Tang Yu had already stood up and was standing beside her. He bent down and put his face next to her ear, so his warm breath enveloped her body. Take it as a welcome party. Chi-Chi, welcome back. His voice was gentle, with a restraint that only he knew. Being alone with her, so close to her soft little neck, he really wanted to take a bite. That night, she was drunk, and it was different from the time when they were in love. That night, his body was temporarily satiated, but somewhere in his heart, it was even emptier. Moreover, it was okay to restrain one's desire for a long time, but once the floodgates were opened, it was very difficult to control. And because of his approach, her body became even more stiff. She gently lifted her body and swept everything into her small bag. There's no need. His eyes were tinged with a trace of imperceptible disappointment, but he didn't force her. He just lightly said, visit Dad when you have time. He misses you very much. Pei Chi thought of Tang Xan's departure, and it seemed that there was no one around Tang Ziyuan. Her eyes were gloomy, and after a while, she nodded. I will. She was about to leave, but her wrist was caught by him. Let go. She tilted her head and looked at him. Her voice was low. Mr. Tang, you've crossed the line. Tang Yu let go of her, smiled lightly, and said gently, I just want to remind you that the photos haven't been taken yet. Pei Chi-Chi's face was a little hot. How could she forget? She quickly turned on the camera. Let's start. Tang Yu sat on the sofa again, casually. Of course, that wouldn't work. Actually, how could Mr. Tang not know how to get rid of business magazines? Pei Chi went over and explained it to him, but he still didn't show the posture she wanted. So she could only teach him step by step. She held his fingers, moved his shoulders, and even his chin, presenting the most perfect posture. Okay, don't move. Perhaps because taking pictures was her job, Pei Chi was much calmer. She picked up the camera and went forward to support his chin, adjusting the angle he wanted. While she was taking photos, Tang Yu asked, are there a lot of men in your photos? Pei Chi paused for a moment and said, quite a lot. Sometimes I take some nude photos. Tang Yu's face immediately darkened, and then he withdrew his perfect posture. Stop filming, the big boss is angry. Pei Chi had already adjusted the camera and was about to shoot when Tang Yu stood up. She was a little confused and looked at him. Tang Yu. Please call me Mr. Tang. Tang Yu looked at her. Get another cameraman here. Pei Chi knew that even if it was someone else, he would still have a reason to make things difficult for her. She had spoken too quickly just now, and now she was regretting it. After a moment of silence and embarrassment, she said, "This is the second time I'm taking the camera. The last time, it was Pei Huan." Tang Yu looked down at her. Miss Pei, are you admitting that you lied? Yes. She raised her little chin. Are you satisfied, Mr. Tang? He sat back down again, so he should be satisfied. Then, he posed for her. She didn't help him adjust his posture, but it was very casual, but it was very seductive, the kind that made people want to tear off his suit. Chapter 786. Out of her photographer's instinct, Pei Chi took a few photos in a row. But she didn't find the feeling she wanted. Her occupational disease was acting up again. She took a few steps forward and took a close-up shot of his face. It seemed that she still didn't get the essence of it, so she walked forward again. His face was very good. No matter how close the shot was, it could still be taken. At this moment, Pei Chi felt very excited and kept taking photos. Very excited. His voice sounded a little sinister. Pei Chi was stunned for a moment, then she nodded. Yes. Very excited. He pushed away her camera and looked into her eyes. I'm very happy that my body makes you so excited, Miss Pei. What he said was a little ambiguous. And they were in that kind of relationship. Pei Chi didn't think that Tang Yu was a particularly immoral person, but under the DNA confirmation, he still did something to her that he shouldn't have. At least, after the results came out, they had sex that night in City H, even though she was drunk. She looked at him calmly and said softly and slowly, "It's just because of our profession." Tang Yu looked at her quietly and didn't say anything. He just let her continue taking photos. However, Pei Chi wasn't in the mood. She didn't feel anything after taking a few more photos, so she put away the camera. It's almost done. Thank you, Mr. Tang. As for the payment, I will send it over personally, he said quickly. Pei Chi nodded. She decided to give it to Xiao Ran when the time came. Old Can was right. Some things couldn't be avoided, so she had to face it. Actually, it wasn't that difficult to get along with him. Tang Yu watched her pack her things, took out a cigarette from the pack and lit it. He took a puff and said, Jinrong went back and told Old Master. His sudden words confused Pei Chi. She looked at him. Tang Yu's tone was calm. A few days ago, Jinrong went back and told Old Master that he wanted to be with you. By being together, I mean getting married. There was no fluctuation in Tang Yu's voice. It was as if he had nothing to do with it. It was as if he was just making a statement. But his dark eyes were locked on hers, and he did not miss the change in her expression. Pei Chi was a little flustered, and she was practically holding her breath. Tang Yu's voice was indifferent as he continued, Old Master has punished him according to the law. Using that arm-thick rattan to whip Jinrong thrice was enough for Jinrong's weak body. At that time, he was there. He watched as Jinrong was whipped. He watched as Jinrong resolutely said that he wanted to be with Pei Chi after being whipped. His heart was as cold as water. No one asked him whether he was willing or not. Just because he gave up on her. Perhaps Jinrong had known all along that he had not given up on Chi, but Jinrong no longer wanted to give in. Jinrong could also see that this was his only chance. He couldn't say that Jinrong was despicable, because he had snatched Pei Chi from Jinrong. At that time, he clearly had a way to help them be together, but he didn't. In the beginning, when he didn't like Chi-Chi very much, he was vaguely unwilling to let go. It was like that in the past, and it was still like that now. He looked at Pei Chi-Chi's surprised face. He probably guessed that she had rejected Jean Rong that day. His heart inexplicably became happy again. Chapter 787. She was carrying a heavy camera on her thin shoulders. She nodded at him and walked out. Tang Yu was still sitting there. When she reached the door, Pei Chi-Chi turned her head around. She saw that Tang Yu was sitting there. His side face was illuminated by the sunlight, and the other side looked a little unfathomable. There was a sense of loneliness that came from being high above the masses. It was a beautiful scene. She put down her camera bag and adjusted the angle, but he didn't move. When she finished taking the photo, Tang Yu said lightly, "This photo can't be used. Also, give me a copy when you're done." Because he didn't want others to see his heart, except for Pei Chi-Chi. Pei Chi-Chi regretted taking the photo. She kept the photo and walked out without saying a word. Tang Yu suddenly said, "Chi-Chi." She didn't stop. In fact, she wanted to cover her ears. Tang Yu's voice came from behind. She couldn't reject him even if she wanted to. "Chi-Chi, I'm here. Waiting for you to come back." Pei Chi-Chi's footsteps paused for a moment, but it was only for a second before he quickly left. However, there seemed to be countless voices behind her saying, "Chi-Chi, I'm here. Chi-Chi, I'm here." She ran into the elevator, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't as strong as she thought. Just one sentence from him was enough to make her burst into tears. The elevator didn't move. Instead, the door opened. A warm body flashed in. Then, she was swept into his warm arms. "Tang Yu." She called his name softly. The camera bag in her hands fell to the ground. In the narrow elevator, he hugged her and couldn't help kissing her forehead. "Chi-Chi, don't cry." She looked up and realized that she was crying. Between her fingers, there were cold tears. She looked up at him helplessly. Tang Yu only hugged her for a moment before letting go. There was restraint in his voice. "Don't cry. Chi-Chi, you're not a child anymore." Pei Chi-Chi wiped away her tears, squatted down to pick up her things, and pressed the number key. Her voice was a little hoarse and deliberately cold. "Call me Miss Pei. I'm not that close to you." Tang Yu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She was real, childish. She hated him. She didn't want him to touch her, not even a little bit of concern. He didn't say anything more. He just walked her down the stairs and watched her leave without looking back. After Pei Chi-Chi went back, she handed the manuscript to the news department for them to polish. Amy took it and looked at the script. "Pei Chi-Chi, this man is really boring." His words were plain and without a hint of humor. Pei Chi-Chi sat down and casually replied. She then imported the photos into the computer for repair. However, she realized that no matter how she fixed it, it would not look as good as the original one. In the end, she decided to use the original one. She picked out 3 of them, 1 for the cover and 2 for the interview inside. Of course, there was the last one. That was the one she was most satisfied with. Anyone who looked at this photo could almost touch the depths of Tang Yu's soul. That sense of loneliness and melancholy could break through the shackles of the photo. Just by looking at it, Pei Chi-Chi's heart trembled slightly. She looked at it for a long time, but in the end, she deleted it. Because she didn't want to look at it anymore. At this moment, Amy slid over. When she saw Tang Yu's photo, she exclaimed, "Oh my God." Amy exclaimed, "I'd love this man even if he asked me to." Chapter 788. Pei Chi-Chi remained silent. Amy's gaze became more attentive and she asked cautiously, "Is Mr. Tang from Xing Yuanfu really your ex-husband?" "Brother." Pei Chi denied it and went to look for the managing editor with the photo and the script. The editor-in-chief was quite satisfied. He looked at the photo carefully and then said meaningfully, "Little Pei, if I were you, I would marry such a man the next day if I had him following me around." Pei Chi smiled and said, "Some people can't be married just because you want to. Even if she did marry, it wouldn't last long." The managing editor chuckled and said, "Little Pei, you are very determined." Pei Chi still smiled and said, "If there are no problems, I will hand it over." The managing editor was satisfied and said with a smile, "Thank you for your hard work. You just got here and you already took on such a big task. Take a day off tomorrow." She was a little surprised, but rest was better than no rest at all. After she went out and handed the script to the people from the news department, she got off work. Amy was a little envious and said, "Chi, shall we go to your place tonight?" It was mainly because of Chi-Chi's cooking. Old Ken had brought them over for a meal and it was delicious. Pei Chi thought that she didn't have much to do, so she nodded and agreed. Amy pounced on her and kissed her on the cheek. "Go back and get ready. We will go over once we get off work." Pei Chi nodded. She went back first. She wanted to use Old Can's room because her place was small. Old Can was not there anyway. Old Can had given his room card to Pei Chi. She went back to put down her things and went over to Old Can's place to see if there were any left. She would never stand on ceremony with him. Compared to Tang Yu, Old Can was more like a brother to her. However, Pei Chi never thought that Old Can would come back. And he wasn't alone. When she went back to the apartment, she saw an exciting scene when she opened the door. Old Can was sitting on the sofa, wearing only a pair of jeans. There was a woman sitting on top of him. Her long black hair fell over her shoulders, making her skin look even fairer. There was a kind of wild beauty to her. The black dress was thrown on the floor. It was a shocking sight. It could be seen that Old Can was reluctant and didn't look like he was enjoying it. It was the woman on top of him who took the initiative to kiss him. But when the door opened, the people inside were shocked. Old Can, in particular, was dumbfounded to see his beloved disciple appear at the door. At this moment, his belt had been undone by the woman on top of him, and even her small hand. "Pei Chi, why are you back?" Old Can was shocked and angry. He quickly pushed the woman away. He hurriedly pulled up the zipper. How embarrassing. Pei Chi hadn't seen the woman on him yet. She smiled and said, "I'll go out first." Just as she was about to leave, the woman who had been pushed to the ground by Lao Can got up and said in a cold voice, "There's no need to go out." "Pei Chi, it's me." When Pei Chi heard the voice, her body stiffened. When she looked again, it was indeed Pei Huan. At this moment, it was like a bolt from the blue. Pei Chi glared at Pei Huan and then moved her eyes to Old Can's face. Old Can's face was covered with a beard, so it was hard to see his expression. Now that Pei Chi was looking at him as if he was a beast, he trembled a little. Chapter 789. He was so tall that she couldn't reach him at all. Old Can had to squat down to cooperate with her. That scene was unbearable to look at. Deceiving his master. "I've said it before, you can sleep with anyone, but you can't sleep with Pei Huan." Pei Chi fiercely buzzed in his ear. Old Can looked at her and then at Pei Huan. He felt quite wronged. But he was a gentleman and didn't say anything about the relationship between a man and a woman. At that moment, Pei Huan, who was only in her underwear, walked over. Her heart was also cold because in Old Can's eyes, she saw the love he had for Pei Chi. Her voice was a little cold. "Don't blame him. I seduced him. Old Can looked at his beloved disciple with a, "You have wronged me," look. Pei Chi let go of his beard, but her expression was still not good. She also looked at Pei Huan with a warning. "How many times have you seen him seducing him?" "3 times. Pei Huan said honestly and seriously. Pei Chi didn't know what to say. At this time, Old Can walked over and buttoned his shirt. He also threw Pei Huan's skirt to her and said indifferently, "Look, it's such a coincidence. Don't pester me anymore. I'm not interested in you." Pei Huan couldn't push Old Can down in front of Pei Chi. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Old Can said directly, "Go and don't come back again." Pei Huan looked at Pei Chi and didn't want to give up. "If Pei Chi didn't come, I would definitely sleep with you." "Maybe. But so what? I have slept with at least 50 women. Miss Pei, you have seen countless people. Do you expect a playboy to take responsibility after sleeping with you once?" Old Can asked her very seriously. But there was a touch of cruelty in his seriousness. Pei Huan glared at him, her eyes watery. Tears fell down like that. She couldn't remember how long it had been since she last cried. Actually, she didn't like this man. He was old, tall, and too rough. However, he treated Pei Chi very well, so well that she was jealous. She also wanted a man like this to love and dote on her. She was not as talented as Pei Chi, not as likable as Pei Chi, and not as pretty as Pei Chi. She had no choice but to seduce men. So, she boldly followed him to his house, seduced him, slept with him. This way, he would like her and take care of her like how he took care of Pei Chi. But he said it so harshly. Pei Huan bit her lips and said in a hoarse voice, "Yes, I have read countless people. Don't worry, not to mention that you haven't slept with me before. Even if you did, I won't let you take responsibility." She walked over to the sofa, grabbed her bag, opened the door and walked out. In that instant, all of Pei Huan's self-esteem was shattered into pieces. When she left, her cheeks were streaming with tears. She thought of Jinrong and how she used the drug to make Jinrong take responsibility. At that time, she wasn't in a good state, but she could still let someone take responsibility for sleeping with her. But today, Old Can's words woke her up. Actually, she was no longer the Pei Huan of the past. In the eyes of men, she was already worthless. What celebrity? No matter how much money she had, it couldn't change the fact that she had slept with so many men. He looked down on her. Pei Huan raised her head, stomped her feet, and burst into tears. She stood at the entrance of the elevator and didn't leave. She just wailed. Chapter 790. Pei Huan was crying so loudly that both Lao Can and Pei Chi heard it. Lao Can scratched his head, feeling a little uncomfortable. "Well, why don't you go and comfort her?" Pei Chi snorted. "Why me? You're the one who slept with her." Lao Can roared, "What do you mean by sleeping with her?" Pei Chi, don't forget that you're a girl. You're my disciple. How could she be so rude to him? Pei Chi snorted. You promised not to sleep with her. Lao Can heard Pei Chi sobbing outside and paced around irritably, glaring at Pei Chi. She's the one who wants to sleep with me. So, you should be the one to comfort her. Pei Chi picked up her purse. Amy and the others will be here soon. I'm going to buy some groceries. Do as you see fit. Anyway, you're not allowed to sleep with her unless you want to marry her. Lao Can said to himself, I'd be crazy to want to marry her. It wasn't that he hated Pei Huan. On the contrary, her little body was quite cute, young and bouncy. Lao Can had no intention of getting married, not to any woman. Pei Chi took the stairs to leave. At this moment, she was afraid of Pei Huan. She was afraid that she would stick to her and wipe her tears and snot on herself. After successfully escaping, Pei Chi thought to herself, actually, Pei Huan isn't that annoying. She's just willful. Lao Ken must be having a hard time now. She thought immorally. Besides, after Pei Huan's antics, her mood after seeing Tang Yu today had faded a lot. With a cigarette in his mouth, Lao Ken opened the door and walked out. He walked to the elevator and watched Pei Huan smoking from 2 or 3 meters away. He leaned against the wall and smoked without saying a word. Pei Huan turned around and glared at Lao Ken as she smoked. He was still smoking with a big beard on his face. Pei Huan's voice carried a tinge of embarrassment and annoyance. Say, have you ever thought of me? Lao Ken lowered his head and took a deep drag. Yes. He wasn't lying. When Pei Huan sat in his arms, he did have a physical urge. How could he not have a reaction when such a lively little body was in his arms? Pei Huan bit her lip. Just because you want to. What else? Old Can's eyes darkened. Marry you. Pei Huan cried again. You bastard. Then don't seduce the bastard. Old Can put out his cigarette. I'll send you down. Also, don't cry. Those who don't know might think that I'm bullying you. Pei Huan, however, refused to leave. I'm not leaving. Isn't Pei Chi here with you? A few female colleagues will be here in a while. Old Can sighed. Let's go. She's already a big girl. No matter what, she's still a celebrity. What's the point of chasing a man like this? Pei Huan stood still and could not be dragged away. I think it's very interesting. If others can come, why can't I? Lao Ken was defeated by her stubbornness. He stood there, glaring at her for a while before shrugging. Up to you. Old Ken walked towards his apartment. Pei Huan wiped her tears and followed him in. He couldn't do anything about her, so he went to take a shower. When he came out, Pei Huan was cleaning the apartment with a vacuum cleaner. Her movements were clumsy, and she looked like she didn't know how to do anything at all. He ignored her and sat on the sofa to watch TV. Pei Huan watched, so she took the vacuum cleaner, raised her butt, straightened her chest, and winked at him as she cleaned. Old Can said calmly, "Don't cramp your eyes." Chapter 791. Pei Chi went to a nearby supermarket to buy groceries. When she walked downstairs, she bumped into Amy and the others, so she brought them up. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find that Pei Huan hadn't left yet. She was mopping the floor, trying her best to make it even dirtier. Lao Ken was sitting there calmly, looking like he had nothing to live for. Amy and the others all knew Pei Huan. When they met, they couldn't help asking Pei Chi in a low voice, "She and Lao Ken are a couple." Before Pei Chi could say anything, Pei Huan put down the vacuum in her hand and said proudly, "I'm here for her." She pointed at Pei Chi and said, "I'm her younger sister." Pei Chi took the vegetables back to the kitchen and said in a lazy voice, "Pei Huan, you're 2 or 3 months older than me. Also, if you want to be my sister, give me half of the pay group." To her surprise, Pei Huan nodded in agreement. "Actually, it's useless for me to have so much money. Pei Chi, if you want it, I can give you half of it." Pei Huan's face was filled with agreement. Pei Chi paused in the middle of washing vegetables and turned to look at Pei Huan. After a long time, she smiled and said, "Pei Huan, if you were so generous in the past, we might not be like this today. Some things couldn't be solved by compensation. Some things can't be redone just because you want to. Feelings couldn't be bought back. Besides, her father was gone. No matter what price she paid, it couldn't be exchanged." Pei Huan's little face turned pale when she said that. She looked at Pei Chi and said in a trembling voice, "Do you still hate me?" "No." Pei Chi sighed. "I'm more used to our previous relationship." Pei Huan stood there for a long time, not caring about the probing eyes of Amy and the others. She clung to old Can, but in fact, she more or less knew who she really wanted to cling to. After standing for a while, she also felt a little bored. She said in a low voice, "Then I'll leave first." Pei Chi's chopping stopped for a moment, and she replied with a faint then. Pei Huan stood there for a while and looked at old Kansas. Old Can smoked and said faintly, "It's useless to look at me." Pei Huan left in shame and indignation. Amy and the others gathered together and giggled. Old Can glanced at them and gave them a warning. After that, he slowly walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter to watch Pei Chi cook. She was very good at household chores, and her hands and feet were nimble. On the other hand, Pei Huan was a completely different kind of missy. She did not know anything. They were clearly children from the same family, but there was such a huge difference between them. It was obvious what was going on. Was it very hard in the past? Old Can asked. Pei Chi was still cooking with her head lowered. She answered Lao Can calmly, "It's all right. Actually, Pei Huan also suffered quite a bit from me." Old Can didn't ask any further and only said, "Actually, you're quite soft-hearted." "No, my heart was eaten by a dog." Pei Chi snorted. "That gigolo." Old Can quickly added, "The photo was taken well, I saw it. I don't think even I can capture the essence of that man." Because she understood him, she was able to grasp the best angle. Pei Chi didn't say anything else and only smiled. After being messed around, the meal became tasteless. Later, when Pei Chi was sending Amy and the others out, she accidentally saw Pei Huan sitting at the staircase. She was sitting there motionlessly, like a stone statue. Pei Chi walked up to her and said, "Pei Huan, what are you doing?" She sounded like she was talking to a disobedient child. Pei Huan looked up and said pitifully, "Pei Chi, I haven't eaten yet. There's no leftovers. I'll throw it all away." Pei Chi made up her mind. Chapter 792. But the noodles you cook are delicious. Pei Huan stared at her. "There's no stock in the fridge." Pei Chi said fiercely, "You can buy it outside." Pei Huan didn't say anything, but she didn't leave either. She just stayed there. Pei Chi walked to Lao Can's apartment and closed the door. She looked at Lao Can with a serious face. "I beg you, please sleep with Pei Huan. I was wrong." Lao Can also looked serious. "Pei Chi, I beg you too. Take your own child with you." In the end, Pei Huan followed Pei Chi back to the small apartment and had a bowl of egg noodles. She wanted to stay there for the night, but she didn't dare to say it. Pei Chi sent her off and finally heaved a sigh of relief. She looked at the time. It was already 10:30. After taking a shower, she lay down on the bed and fell asleep. However, she didn't sleep well the entire night. Every time she fell asleep, she would see the photo she had taken swaying in front of her. It was a melancholy Tang Yu. She dreamed that there was another Pei Chi by Tang Yu's side. Tang Yu would hug that Chi and kiss that Chi every day. That Chi and Tang Yu lived together, but something was wrong. It was strange. When she woke up, she was covered in cold sweat. She only remembered that in her dream, a voice kept calling her. Telling her to go back. Go back. Where else could she go? Pei Chi hugged her knees and looked out at the dark night carefully. Suddenly, she felt that she should go see Tang Ziyuan, the man who was related to her by blood. To be honest, he treated her well after her miscarriage. He really loved her like a daughter. She didn't know if other people's miscarriages would be like hers. She was in a coma for a month, and she didn't recover until half a year later. During that time, even the slightest strenuous exercise made her sweaty and extremely weak. Pei Chi went to Yanhui. To her, this place was like a dream. Her heart was as calm as still water, mostly because her appearance had completely ruined Zhao Ku and Tang Xian's lives. Maybe she really shouldn't have appeared. Yanhui was still as luxurious as a royal palace. But a house without two hostesses was always less lively. Tang Ziyuan was a little surprised. He thought for a moment and said, "Miss, please have a seat in the living room. I'll be down soon." He didn't go down immediately, but made a phone call first before changing his clothes and going downstairs. Pei Chi brought some specialties from H City. Although it wasn't worth much, it was still a gift from her. Hearing the sound of footsteps, she looked up and felt that Tang Ziyuan had aged a little. She stood up unconsciously, but she couldn't bring herself to call him father. Tang Ziyuan didn't force her. He lowered his hands and motioned for her to sit down. He sat beside her and asked very gently, "How have you been recently?" Pei Chi nodded. "It's all right." Tang Ziyuan knew what she was thinking, so he smiled. "I'm fine too. But it's a little lonely living here alone. I always think of the time when Tang Xian was here. Maybe it's because I'm getting old. Some things in the past are still a little too extreme. If it were now, I might stay with the last model." After he finished speaking, he realized that he might have hurt her, so he changed the topic. "Your mother Yun will come over in a while. She and Zhao Yi gave birth to a pair of twins. They are already a year old. They are very cute. You should meet them too." A pair of twins. Pei Chi looked down. She hesitated for a moment and nodded. "But I didn't prepare a gift," she said awkwardly. Pei Chi was stunned, but Tang Yu directly stuffed the little pink dumpling into her hands and helped his mother get out of the car. He carried the blue baby in one hand and the little one's toys and snacks in the other. Although the two babies only traveled for half a day, a big nanny bag was stuffed full. Although Lin Yun was already 50 years old and had given birth to a pair of twins, she looked much younger because of Zhao Yi's love. She looked like she was in her 40s. Chapter 794. Pei Chi-Chi's eyes fell on the little baby in her arms. Because it was too cute, she didn't know what to do. She didn't know whether to return it or continue to hold it. Lin Yun looked at Pei Chi-Chi calmly and smiled. "Chi-Chi, can you hold it for me for a while?" Pei Chi-Chi looked at the little guy in her arms and came back to her senses. She looked up at Lin Yun and nodded. This silly child. Lin Yun was still smiling. She walked over and chatted with Tang Ziyuan as if they were old friends. No matter how unwilling Tang Ziyuan was, he had to admit that Zhao Yi was more suitable for her than he was after seeing Lin Yun become younger day by day. Tang Yu carried the baby boy and the luggage in one hand. He glanced at Pei Chi-Chi. "You're not going in." Pei Chi-Chi was a little dazed. She looked down at the little guy in her arms. The little pink ball said sweetly, "Sister." Pei Chi-Chi was surprised. A 1-year-old child could already speak so clearly. She couldn't help but pinch that soft little face and let out an "n" sound. After that, she was hugged by a pair of chubby little hands. Pei Chi-Chi looked at Tang Yu. "What's her name?" Tang Yu paused and said lightly, "I've been in America, so I haven't decided on a name. I have a nickname, Xiaoxin." Xiaoxin. Pei Chi-Chi was stunned. She remembered that Tang Xian liked to stick to her and say, "Chi-Chi, I'll be your Xiaoxin from now on." Thinking of this, Her eyes became a little hot and she couldn't help but hug the little ball tighter. Hugging the warm little body in his arms, it was as if all the pain had been healed. Xiaoxin probably liked her a lot. Hugging her with her chubby little hands was not enough. Her whole body lay on her shoulder and she looked very proud. Hug. Pei Chi felt like she was melting. She tightened her arms and hugged the little guy. In the living room, she hesitated. Should she return the little heart to Lin Yun, or continue to hold it herself? She didn't want to put it down. Xiaoxin's heart softened and she held it in her arms like a doll. Tang Yu put down his luggage. Lin Yun packed up and gave a toy to her son as a way to get him to play by himself. She then looked up at Pei Chi and said, "His name is Zhao Yan." Pei Chi nodded and looked at the baby boy. He looked exactly like Zhao Yi. But Xiaoxin. Perhaps because she had inherited more of her mother's genes, her facial features were somewhat similar to Tang Yu's. At this time, Pei Chi also did not realize why the baby boy had a name, but Xiaoxin did not have a name. Xiaoxin obediently allowed herself to be carried. After a while she wanted to come down and play with her brother. The chubby little body slid down and sat opposite little Zhao Yan. The two babies sat together on the thick carpet and took apart toys. They were very cute and obedient, and didn't need to worry about them at all. Tang Ziyuan coughed lightly and said to Tang Yu, who had been sitting there drinking tea, "I'm going upstairs with your mother to talk about something." Tang Yu smiled lightly, "Don't tell me you still want to remarry Mom." This kid, how could he make such a joke? However, Tang Ziyuan also sighed. He knew that Tang Yu had finally forgiven him, otherwise he would not have made such a joke. He paused. If your Uncle Zhao heard it, he would be jealous again. Lin Yun glanced at him. "Do you think everyone is like you?" Tang Ziyuan touched his nose. He was the most helpless when it came to his ex-wife, but now he could let it go. He had always been noble, and it was rare for him to sit on the carpet like this, but it was not out of place. However, Pei Chi was uncomfortable. She looked down at Xiaoxin, hesitating if she should stand up. Tang Yu glanced at her. "Pei Chi, isn't it normal for us to bring our younger siblings to play together?" Younger siblings. Asking for Chi-Chi's psychological trauma, Pei Chi lowered her head and didn't say anything. Xiaoxin's soft voice called out, "Big brother, carry me." "Big brother can't carry you, can big sister carry you?" Pei Chi especially liked the feeling of Xiaoxin hugging her. That milky scent was especially pleasant. Chapter 796. Pei Chi did not say anything. This brother was Tang Yu. She pursed her lips and watched as Tang Yu carried Xiaoxin over. Xiaoxin seemed to be very familiar with him as she affectionately wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him. Pei Chi-Chi's eyes were a little hot. She was a little envious and jealous as she thought, after all, they had the same mother but different fathers. She was different from her sister who had different parents. At this moment, Xiaoxin began to sneeze, one after another. Tang Yu picked up a tissue from the side and wiped her little face clean. His movements were very skillful and calm. Pei Chi was a little worried. Did she catch a cold? It's congenital rhinitis. She'll be fine after spraying some medicine. Tang Yu took a small medicine box from the side and held Xiaoxin in his arms. He let her little P*SS sit on his arm while her chubby little hand hugged his shoulder. Pei Chi had to admit that she was attracted by his cuteness. She looked at his raised little face and carefully and gently sprayed some medicine on it. Miraculously, it stopped. It was just that Xiaoxin was not feeling well before, so she was acting coquettishly now. She leaned on Tang Yu like a little sheep, her little P*SS proudly facing Pei Chi. That little P*SS shook and shook. Pei Chi was envious and wanted to hug this fragile little thing, but Tang Yu did not say anything. He just patted the little baby in this position. Xiaoxin made a snoring sound like a little pig and fell asleep after a while. Her pretty little mouth was drooling, and the drool dripped onto Tang Yu's shoulder. He frowned slightly, and used a tissue to help the little girl wipe it off. Pei Chi looked at the gentleness between his brows. She had never seen him so gentle before. Perhaps he was gentle to her in the past, but the two were different. She looked at it quietly. Tang Yu coughed softly. "Take out a little bear from this bag and follow me upstairs to send her to bed." Pei Chi looked at little Zhao Yan. "What about him? He can play by himself." Tang Yu's tone was indifferent, but it had its own aura. Pei Chi really went to get the teddy bear and followed behind him. She walked behind him and made a face at him. If it wasn't for Xiaoxin's cuteness, she wouldn't have listened to him. She thought that he didn't know what she was doing behind his back, but Tang Yu's low voice rang out in front of her. "Pei Chi, you're very childish." She snorted softly but didn't say anything, ignoring him. When Pei Chi passed by the study, she saw Lin Yun and Tang Ziyuan drinking tea and playing chess. The two of them were quite relaxed. On the contrary, Tang Yu was more like a nanny. When Tang Yu passed by, he said to Lin Yun, who was inside, "Little Yen is downstairs alone." Lin Yun immediately got up and Tang Ziyuan also eagerly followed her downstairs. As he walked, he asked in a low voice, "What's going on?" "I think Tang Yu is up to no good. He won't mess around here, will he?" "What can he do? Don't forget that they are siblings now. Do you think Tang Yu is like you?" Lin Yun rolled her eyes at Tang Ziyuan. They were getting along quite well now, like old friends. It was just that Lin Yun was always teasing him. But when she didn't tease him, he felt a little bored. This way, everyone was at ease. Tang Ziyuan touched his nose. They are not real siblings. Chapter 797. It had to be said that men knew men best. Even in this situation, Tang Yu had slept with her once. Lin Yun didn't answer. She picked up little Zhao Yan. Little Zhao Yan's mouth was mumbling. He also wanted to sleep, but he wanted to drink milk. Tang Ziyuan had also raised a child before. At this time, he blushed and went out. He held a cigarette and thought silently. He actually wanted to see it, but he didn't dare to. After all, she was not his woman, and the child was not his. Zhao Yi's baby. Zhao Yi's woman. Upstairs, little Xiaoxin was put down by Tang Yu, half awake and half asleep. After she was put down, she became restless, and like little Zhao Yan, she pouted her little mouth, and then put her thumb into her little mouth and ate it desperately. His plump little body tossed and turned, refusing to sleep. After messing around like this for a while, he did not eat anything and began to cry. Tang Yu patted the little guy, but he couldn't coax her. He looked up and looked at Pei Chi on the opposite side of the bed. His eyes were deep. "Coax her." Pei Chi refused in her heart. "I don't know how to." Although Xiaoxin was cute, she was his sister. Tang Yu's eyes darkened. He stared at her for a while. Pei Chi took a step back, but he was very fast. In an instant, he put the milky baby into her arms. The soft, fragrant, and snoring baby stared at her with its pitch-black phoenix eyes. At that moment, Pei Chi seemed to see Tang Axian and couldn't refuse. Tang Axian was also soft and cute. She also looked at her and called her Chi. She clumsily hugged the little guy and patted him. "Xiaoxin wants to sleep, right? Close your eyes and sleep." The little baby opened his eyes and looked at her. He licked his little mouth eagerly. very obedient. Pei Chi sang a children's song. In the beginning, Xiaoxin was quite happy. But as she listened, she pouted her little mouth. Wow! It's so unpleasant to hear. How about telling stories? Pei Chi reached out her hand, wanting to take the storybook from the bedside table, but the baby's chubby little hand had already quietly reached out. It nimbly undid Pei Chi's buttons, and then whimpered through her bra. The little guy held it in his little hands and ate it greedily and eagerly. Pei Chi was stunned. Pei Chi was dumbfounded. Pei Chi was dumbfounded. She maintained her original posture and looked down at the little guy who was wolfing down the food. The little fellow also raised his eyes, his big teary eyes looking at Pei Chi accusingly, not even one. He took a few more breaths, but still couldn't eat it. Just as Pei Chi was about to pull her away, she suddenly thought of something. She looked up and saw Tang Yu leaning on the side, looking at her with a burning gaze. Her face heated up, and she hurriedly tried to take off the little guy, but the temper of a child who wanted to sleep was the worst. When Pei Chi exerted force, she started crying, and the sound was earth-shattering. Pei Chi silently thought to herself, "Lin Yun, come over quickly. It'll be fine once she comes and carries me away." But Lin Yun didn't appear. Instead, the little guy rubbed against her arms more and more, looking as if he was unwilling to eat it. Pei Chi was flustered and didn't know what to do. She had no experience in dealing with such a little kid. At first, she was a little angel, but now she had turned into a little devil. "Do you need help?" Tang Yu's voice was very calm. Pei Chi was almost moved to tears. "Yes." Her voice was soft and velvety. Chapter 798. Pei Chi's body turned cold as she realized what he had done to her. She was initially holding on to Xiaoxin, but now that she was being treated like this by Tang Yu, she instinctively covered her own body. But just like that, the baby let out a chirp, and its soft little body began to move in a free-fall motion, falling onto the soft bed. Although the bed was soft, this was the most intolerable thing for a baby who was about to fall asleep. Xiaoxin's little P*PS were facing the sky, and her little floral skirt was lifted up, revealing a cute little bear printed on her little breasts. Moreover, her P*PS were plump, soft, and tender, and her little short legs were also extremely cute. The little fellow's little head was buried in the bed sheets, crying, and her little P*PS were shaking, which was especially adorable. Pei Chi looked at it eagerly, and she was also frightened. She had no idea how alluring she looked when she was half naked and covered with her hands. At least, at this time, Tang Yu didn't look at the crying little fellow, but stared at Pei Chi's body with a fiery gaze. That little cute baby cried for a long time, and was a little tired, and no one cared about her. It was too hateful. The plump little fellow turned over, and his dark little eyes stared at Pei Chi, and his delicate little face was a little unhappy. Then, the little fellow climbed up, and stood at the right height on the bed. His little hand moved Pei Chi's hand away, and then he ate her. Pei Chi was frightened, and she wanted to push him away, but when she thought of that earth-shattering sound, she hesitated. She hesitated for a moment, and was entangled by Xiaoxin. The little hands held her, and with a chirping sound, he climbed directly onto her body, hugged her with his 4 paws, and ate contentedly. Although there was still nothing, the little fellow was still satisfied with this kind of real touch. He ate with all his might, and the little fellow ate until he was sweating all over, but he still didn't eat. He loosened his grip a little, and with a plop sound, he raised his head and looked at Pei Chi pitifully, and his little head went to the other side. Tang Yu's eyes looked like they were on fire as he looked at the place where he had eaten. Pei Chi hugged her little heart and used one hand to cover herself with her clothes, but the more it was like this, the more tempting it was. Tang Yu's gaze seemed to want to swallow her alive, but he still restrained himself. Xiaoxin used up all her strength and fell asleep with sweat all over her body. Her rosy little mouth opened and her little body lay in Pei Chi-Chi's arms like a little frog. Pei Chi-Chi was not easy to hold. She bit her lip and looked at Tang Yu. Hold her. Tang Yu's gaze fell on a certain spot. He smiled faintly and came over to carry Xiaoxin. Chapter 799. No. Pei Chi-Chi bit her lip, and her voice was weak. She wanted to push him away, but she was worried about Xiaoxin and Lin Yun and Tang Ziyuan downstairs, so she didn't dare to argue with him. Tang Yu's face was on her thin shoulder, and his fingers slid over the scar on her waist and abdomen. Xiaoxin was taken out from here, but she didn't know. His fingers were flexible and gentlemanly, and his voice was hoarse. You seem to be a little bigger. Although she had never fed a child, a woman who had given birth to a child was always different. She was thin before, but recently she seemed to have gained a little weight. He didn't see it in other places, but when Xiaoxin lifted her clothes and ate her, he could really see that she was a little more plump than before, and there was that kind of bone-chilling taste between his fingers. But he was now her brother. Damn brother. He was not serious. Pei Chi-Chi suddenly grabbed her clothes tightly and bit her lip. Let go of me. Tang Yu was about to let go, and he didn't intend to do anything to her here. However, it was such a coincidence that Tang Ziyuan and Lin Yun appeared at the door of the children's room with little Zhao Yan in their arms. They sent little Zhao Yan over to sleep. She didn't expect to see her brother bullying his sister. Tang Yu hugged Pei Chi-Chi from behind, and his fingers were still in places where they shouldn't be. It was obvious that he was bullying her. Tang Ziyuan threw a look at Lin Yun. I told you. Lin Yun was also quite speechless in her heart. Men were not good things. It was Tang Yu who arranged this kind of brother-sister relationship. It was one thing to care about the overall situation, but it was mainly to satisfy his selfish desire to play with a taboo. She was sure of her son's excellence, but it seemed that she still didn't know enough about his shamelessness. This was the only thing Tang Ziyuan did better than her. As soon as Tang Yu saw his parents, he calmly let go of Pei Chi-Chi and explained, Xiaoxin wanted to sleep just now, and she was pestering her. This simple sentence made Lin Yun and Tang Ziyuan think of 1,000 words. Lin Yun naturally knew about Xiaoxin's habit. Tang Ziyuan, on the other hand, had watched little Zhao Yan. They probably had the same habit. Pei Chi-Chi's face was hot. She didn't care about anything else and said in a low voice, I'll leave first. Tang Yu didn't say anything, but his eyes fell on Tang Ziyuan's face. Tang Ziyuan cursed in his heart. You are the one who wants to be a shitty brother and sister. Now you are like this. Do you want me, the father, to pimp for my children? Although he was angry, Tang Ziyuan still gently asked Pei Chi-Chi to stay for dinner. However, how could Pei Chi-Chi stay? The scene just now was too shameful. There's no need. I told old Can that we would have dinner together, she said softly. Then, she went downstairs and walked quickly, with the intention of escaping. Who's old Can? Tang Ziyuan was a little surprised. Tang Yu had already walked quickly towards the door and said, it's the manager of her magazine. After he left, Tang Ziyuan and Lin Yun went to the living room outside and closed the door carefully so as not to wake up the two babies. Tang Ziyuan sighed, Yun, do you think these two children can still be together? Although Tang Yu's attitude was ambiguous, it seemed that he didn't want to talk about it. It seemed that he wanted to keep Pei Chi-Chi in suspense. Chapter 800. Tang Ziyuan blushed when he heard that. I'm not happy even if he's not happy. His wife was mine to begin with. Lin Yun glanced at him and Tang Ziyuan didn't say anything. He rubbed his nose and his heart was in a mess. Lin Yun's voice was light. You're already so old. It's past the time to be competitive. Calm down. Tang Ziyuan didn't like what she said. After taking a sip of tea, he snorted. You're already so old, but you still have a child. Lin Yun didn't want to talk to him anymore. Although Zhao Ku had been gone for 2 years, she still didn't want to come here. If it wasn't for Tang Yu, she wouldn't have come. Tang Ziyuan saw that she pursed her lips and didn't say anything. He understood her. They had been married for so many years that they could tell what each other was thinking with just a look. Thus, he sighed. All right, I won't talk about it anymore. Let's get along peacefully. I'll treat Zhao Yi as my younger brother from now on. The more he said, the more ridiculous he sounded. Lin Yun rolled her eyes at him. Tang Ziyuan was a little childish at this moment. He felt like he was abandoned. Look, everyone had a partner and he was the only one living in such a big house. Once he was sad, he said, come on, come and walk around when you're free. I won't be angry even if you bring Zhao Yi. Seeing him like this, Lin Yun's heart softened. She said gently, Ziyuan, if you're really lonely, find a companion. Tang Ziyuan said sourly, I'm not as good as Zhao Yi. He got pregnant as a newlywed. Lin Yun was annoyed. He didn't stop. He sneered and said, Mr. Tang, you're not bad yourself. You're still as good as ever. Isn't that model pregnant too? Tang Ziyuan wanted to say something but sighed. Yun, let's not talk about this anymore. They really weren't suitable for each other. Peace didn't last long before they quarreled and brought up old scores. Zhao Yi was more suitable for her. Lin Yun's heart softened as well when he admitted defeat. Downstairs, as soon as Pei Chichi walked out of the hall, Tang Yu chased after her with the car key in his hand. I'll give you a ride. Pei Chichi didn't stop. I can walk myself. There are no buses at the entrance, and there are very few taxis. He reminded her indifferently. He was no longer as impulsive as he was when they were alone upstairs. Pei Chichi paused. He thought she had given in, but Pei Chichi raised the phone in her hand. I can Didi. Soft product placement. Didi hailing taxis should pay Yao advertising fees. Tang Yu looked at her and the phone in her hand without saying anything. As Pei Chichi walked towards the door, he faintly said, Pei Chichi, is it necessary to be so clear with me? She paused again and said softly, I'm scared. Tang Yu. She turned to look at him and said quietly, I'm afraid it won't be clear. She did not want to do that kind of ambiguous thing with him again. They had been together for a long time and had done it countless times. She was very clear about the look in his eyes that he wanted her. Just now, upstairs, he had used that kind of look to look at her again and again. Tang Yu put his hand in his pocket and smiled faintly. Pei Chichi, are you afraid that you will break through the secular world? When he asked this, her anger instantly ignited and exploded into a small universe. Chapter 801. Suddenly, she smiled faintly. Tang Yu, thank you for giving up on me. With that, she turned around and walked straight to the door. Tang Yu stood under the sun, but the sun couldn't warm him up because his little son was leaving him. He took a few steps forward and grabbed her wrist. If you don't care now, stay for dinner. His eyes were almost stern. Unless you're afraid. Pei Chichi was stunned for a moment. She wanted to break free, but he was holding her hand so tightly that her hand hurt badly. Why should I listen to you? Her voice was sharp. You bastard. She struggled and ran to the door. But before she could take a few steps, he caught her again. This time, he stopped her by the waist and carried her to his car. "What are you doing? You're crazy. Let go of me." Pei-Chi-Chi punched his shoulder and kicked her legs. She thought that he was crazy. She was his biological sister. This was Tang Xuan's place, and he dared to mess around. "I'm crazy." He hugged her and was unmoved. His voice was cold. "Pei-Chi-Chi, if you don't want me to go crazy, you'd better behave." She was not obedient. She was still struggling, kicking and screaming. Tang Yu controlled her with one hand to prevent her from escaping. With the other hand, he opened the back seat and threw her in. Then, the door closed. Tang Yu got in the car too. Pei-Chi-Chi lay on the back seat in a sorry state. He was right behind her. "I'm so excited. So perverted. The brother is going to teach his sister a lesson." She wanted to get up, but he pressed her back with one hand. His voice was incredibly hoarse. In the Tang family, disobedient children have to be taught a lesson. Pei-Chi-Chi kicked and bit him. "My surname is not Tang. Let go of me." Tang Yu's eyes dimmed. "Pei-Chi-Chi, why didn't you take the surname Tang after marrying me?" On one hand, it was because she was disobedient, and on the other hand, it was because of his deep-rooted bad habits. Lastly, it was because he really couldn't endure it anymore. For a man who wasn't even 30 yet, he had to endure it for a long time. Just because of this damned identity. Then he would make good use of this identity. He pressed her down and slapped her with his large palm. "Paw!" Pei-Chi-Chi cried out. Her voice was pitiful, and there was a hint of trembling in her voice. The dormant beast in Tang Yu's body was released. His whole body was filled with hot blood. It seemed like it had been a long time since he had bullied her like this. He mercilessly spanked her a few times until her tears flowed out. Pei-Chi-Chi scolded him in all kinds of languages. In the past, the little girl who only knew how to scold others. "Shameless, you are a bastard, shameless, bad guy." Now, she was especially good at scolding others. This was all learned from Lao, Kansas. The more she scolded him, the fiercer he hit her. Look at what this little fellow of his had learned in the past 1 year. After a long time, she started crying, and his eyes were red. When he finally let go of her, he was shocked. How could he bear to hit her so hard? However, Tang Yu knew that he was jealous. He was jealous because she smiled at Lao Kan and even sat in his car and hugged him. He was also jealous that Jean Rong could hold her little hand and confess to her. He even dared to tell old Master Tang that he wanted to marry her. His eyes were bloodshot. How could he? Chapter 802. Pei-Chi-Chi was sprawled on the back seat. She had been spanked a few times and her face was full of tears. It was too shameful. Tang Yu's body bent down and he covered her tightly. His handsome face was right next to her cheek. Her little face was cold because of her tears, but his face was a little hot. It was very quiet in the car. There was only the occasional sound of her sobbing. Pei-Chi-Chi's body was weak. After being spanked a few times, she felt a little dizzy and could not get up for a long time. Her side profile was quiet and there were a few drops of tears on her long eyelashes. When she blinked, they rolled down like dewdrops. Her eyelids were also pink because of crying. Her little face was usually pale, but now there was a tinge of red. That delicate texture made him want to take a bite. Of course, he wanted to bite her little mouth even more. That was what he thought, and he did it. Tang Yu felt that he was no longer an impulsive teenager, but he still could not control himself and bit her. It was soft and tender. He could not help but move forward and gently suck on her lips. Pei Chi was still dizzy and had not woken up, so she let him do it. Tang Yu's whole body was warm. He turned sideways and lay down in the cramped car. He pulled her into his arms and carefully laid her down. Pei Chi's eyes were closed. She still looked delicate and weak. Her little mouth was slightly opened. He knew that she was in a semi-conscious state. He knew that he should not do it. He knew that his parents might be watching from above, but he could not bear it. She hated him no matter what. So what if he was more hateful? He entered her slightly opened sweet mouth and tasted her. Just kissing her like this was not enough to satisfy him. He thought of the way Xiaoxin ate her, and his blood boiled. He could not help but unbutton her top and buried his head. When Pei Chi woke up, she felt that her body was a little strange. She looked down and was shocked. Her little hand grabbed his hair forcefully. Tang Yu. Tang Yu was originally quite intoxicated, but now that he was thrown to the side, her clothes were in a mess. She quickly sat up and hugged herself. Her clothes slid down, revealing her slender body and fair waist. Tang Yu sat on the opposite seat and tidied up his clothes. He didn't do anything but just sat there and looked at her. Pei Chi tugged at her clothes for a long time, but she couldn't pull it properly. He finally came over, his voice hoarse. "I'll help you." Pei Chi slapped his handsome face. This was the number of times Pei Chi had slapped him. However, Tang Yu was thick-skinned and didn't care at all. He directly carried her over, put her on his lap, and buttoned her up without saying anything or explaining anything. He had indeed kissed her, and there was even more contact. He was just one step away from having sex. Pei Chi turned her face to the side, looking a little embarrassed. "Let go of me." He obeyed and let go of her, but he didn't get out of the car. Instead, he locked the door. Pei Chi was furious. She banged on the car window. "Tang Yu, what do you want?" He was a jerk. She glared at him, but he didn't budge. In a moment of desperation, Pei Chi grabbed his arm and bit down. Tang Yu's voice sounded from above her head. "You can't get out of this car without a fingerprint to unlock it." He paused for a while and said self-deprecatingly, "Actually, Pei Chi, it would be good if we could stay together." Chapter 803. Pei Chi slowly raised her eyes and looked at him stubbornly. Tang Yu ignored his aching arm and said, "I'll take you back." He then strode over to the driver's seat, picked up the pack of cigarettes on the control panel, and lit a cigarette. The window was lowered a little. He started the car with one hand and drove away from Yanhui Road with the other. Pei Chi sat in the back seat, curled up. She didn't look at him but only looked out of the window. Every second she spent with him was torture because she couldn't ignore his strong aura. It was silent along the way. An hour later, the black limousine finally stopped at her apartment. It was already noon, and he could have forced her to stay in Yanhui Road for lunch. But, after what had happened between them, she would probably be uneasy. He thought about it and brought her back. Tang Yu's slender fingers rested on the steering wheel and he said softly, "Don't you have anything to say to me? Do you want to hear about beasts or animals?" Pei Chi moved to the car door and wanted to open it, but she couldn't. She pounded on the door and shouted angrily, "Tang Yu, open it for me." He was still sitting calmly, his voice even softer. "Pei Chi, I'm hungry." "Pei Chi, I'm hungry. I want to eat the noodles you cooked, and I want to eat you." Pei Chi's hand was raised in the air and then she slowly put it down. She looked at the man in front of her and her lips moved slightly. She couldn't make a sound for a long time. She remembered that when he came back from a business trip, she was cooking in the kitchen. He went straight to her, hugged her from behind, kissed her little neck, and told her that he was hungry. In the end, they didn't eat and he carried her to the counter. That was the only time they did it in the kitchen. It didn't feel good because they were afraid that the person opposite would hear them. And the counter was too cold and hard, and she didn't feel comfortable. Later, she was carried to the soft bed. After a few times, when she was dizzy, his voice rang in her ears, "Pei Chi-Chi, are you comfortable now?" Later on, when Tang Yu wanted something, he would occasionally hug her and tell her that he was hungry. Now hearing him say this, Pei Chi-Chi heard an indescribable irony. She smiled, looked out of the window, and said in a light voice, "You can find your fiancé." Tang Yu was silent. Just when she thought he wouldn't answer, he said in a flat voice, "There's nothing between me and her." What did he say about an unmarried couple? Pei Chi-Chi sneered and did not reply. Tang Yu looked at her profile in the rearview mirror for a long time. He reached out and pressed the button. The car door unlocked. His voice was slightly hoarse. "You can get out now." Pei Chi-Chi opened the car door and left without hesitation. Tang Yu sat for a while and couldn't help but get out again. He stood there and watched her back view disappear into the elevator. The phone in his pocket rang. He looked at it and saw that it was Shen Lian. Her tone wasn't good. "Tang Yu, I want to see you." Tang Yu's gaze was still on the entrance of the elevator, and his voice was indifferent. "I'm not free right now." "Then when will you be free?" Shen Lian's voice was sharp. "Do I have to sell 20% of Xingyuan?" Tang Yu's body was cold, and he had never been so tired. If he was facing a normal competitor, he wouldn't be so tired. But Shen Lian was a lunatic. She even knew that he had once wanted to kill her. However, she still had a glimmer of hope for him. As long as he loved her, she was willing to forget everything and start afresh with him. "Medicine." "I took it." An innocent smile appeared on her face, completely different from her deep thoughts. "Tang Yu, I'm serious." "I also answered you seriously." Tang Yu smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Shen Lian stood up. "Why can't I warm your heart after so many years?" Chapter 805. Her expression was a little confused. Then, she sneered, "Yes, I'm cold-blooded. I caused my own father to end up like that. I even told Tang Xian about it on purpose." In the end, she stupidly ended her life. Tang Xian is great, and I'm despicable, am I right? Shen Lian stared at Tang Yu. "No matter how despicable I am, I still extracted my bone marrow to save Pei Chi-Chi. I saved your precious baby. And this is how you repay me." Tang Yu's expression was calm. "You can also tell Pei Chi-Chi everything. You can even sell Xing Yuan's shares. You can do all of these." Shen Lian was stunned. "Aren't you afraid?" "I am." Tang Yu rubbed his eyebrows. "But Shen Lian, it's also a form of relief for me." He had too many concerns. He couldn't act rashly. Before Shen Lian became desperate, he really didn't want to break the peace. He didn't want to lose all of them. What he cared about the most was Tang Xian's departure and Pei Chi-Chi's health. If it wasn't for his choice, Tang Xian wouldn't have left so quickly. And Chi-Chi would blame him. However, all of this would eventually be forgiven because of Xiaoxin's background, because of his Chi-Chi's soft-heartedness. Looking at her child, she couldn't bear to hate him for long. But he couldn't lose Xing Yuan now. The Lins and Xing Yuan were connected. Even if Xing Yuan was lost, the Lins would still be cautious. He couldn't use the two big families to play a love game with Shen Lian. Moreover, he would be more passive if he lost everything. At that time, what could he do to stop a madwoman from taking revenge? A cornered Shen Lian would be the scariest. Shen Lian's voice was tense. "I don't believe it." "Up to you." Tang Yu didn't have the mood to eat. He turned around and left. He put his finger on the doorknob. Shen Lian rushed over and hugged him from behind. She hugged him tightly and murmured like a little lamb, no longer as fierce and vicious as before, "Tang Yu, don't go." She buried her face in his back and murmured, "I'm just scared. Pei Chi is back. I know you've met with her and even let her do an exclusive interview. I'm afraid you'll be with her again." She left his back and raised her head to look at the back of his head, smiling bitterly. "I was so scared. I dreamt that Pei Chi took everything from me, including you. You're thinking too much." Tang Yu's voice was very soft. "Don't forget, I'm her brother now. You dare to say that you don't want her? When you look at her, don't you remember how you used to make love? Don't you want to carry her to bed?" Shen Lian's voice was sharp. Tang Yu pursed his thin lips. After a moment, he turned around and was just a step away from Shen Lian. Shen Lian raised her sharp chin and her voice became sharper. "Tang Yu, do you dare to say no?" "Yes." His voice was deep. "Are you satisfied now?" Shen Lian's expression was stunned. She then hugged her head and screamed, "Why should I be satisfied? Tang Yu, don't you think it's a sin? You've done so much and you've aborted her child. Do you think she'll still accept you and let you have sex with her?" Tang Yu looked at her as though he was looking at a lunatic. In reality, Shen Lian was crazy. She was tormented by her own inner demons. With tears streaming down her face, she looked at him and begged, "Tang Yu, don't love her, okay? You love me, okay?" Chapter 806. She had also said that she would never beg him again. But when Pei Chi set foot on this piece of land again, she was afraid that she couldn't sleep day and night. Pei Chi would come back and take everything away from her. Tang Yu looked at her and didn't say anything. He wasn't so naive to think that she could turn back and let him go. If she could, she wouldn't have been so crazy to hurt Shen Zhongshan. He didn't soften up for her. He opened the door and went straight out, as if he didn't hear her crying behind him. He and Shen Lian formed a dead end, and neither of them would take the initiative to break this strange balance. He was waiting, and Shen Lian was delaying. If she couldn't get what she wanted, he couldn't get what he wanted either. Tang Yu lit a cigarette at the door and slowly walked out. When he returned to Yanhui, Lin Yun and Tang Ziyuan were both sitting and waiting for him. The two babies were still sleeping. Tang Yu went upstairs to check on Xiaoxin first. When he came down, Lin Yun asked first, "How is it?" Tang Yu walked to the sofa and sat down. His body slightly sank into the soft sofa and he rubbed the space between his eyebrows. "Nothing." Lin Yun was a little anxious. "You can't let Xiaoxin stay here forever. She was the grandmother. If this got out, people would laugh their teeth off." Tang Yu looked at his mother. His lips moved, but in the end, he didn't say anything. On this matter, it was rare for him to show weakness. He couldn't predict what Chi-Chi would think after knowing the truth. Would she hate him even more? Seeing that he didn't say anything, Lin Yun didn't say anything. In fact, they knew Tang Yu very well. How could they not guess that Tang Yu had something on his mind? Lin Yun hesitated and said, "Tang Yu, we're old enough to see and experience things. We really don't lack anything. So you don't have to worry about anything because of us." Tang Yu wiped his face with his hand, and his body leaned back. He didn't speak for a long time. After a long time, he stood up and smiled. "Mom, Chi-Chi's condition hasn't completely passed the observation period. The incubation period for this disease was 3 years. After 3 years, there wouldn't be any problems. In other words, he could not completely fall out with Shen Lian for the next 3 years. On the day of the engagement, he had done something to Shen Lian's car. At that time, he did not know about it. Later on, when he found out, he could no longer do anything to the bone marrow source. Even if the chances of a successful bone marrow transplant after a relapse were very small, he would rather keep Shenlian. No one knows a son better than his mother. Tang Yu only said half a sentence, but Lin Yun understood. She was stunned. Then, she let out a long sigh. Tang Yu, this child, why did he have to do this? He had thrown his life away, all for the sake of that unpredictable future. But have you ever thought that 3 years is enough to change a lot of things? Lin Yun sighed softly. Jinrong begged Old Master to fulfill his wish. Although he hit her a few times, Old Master relented. One must know that Pei Chi-Chi and Jinrong were originally a couple. In the past, Jinrong had sacrificed so much for Pei Chi-Chi. Even if they were together now, no one in the world would object. Tang Yu's expression was blank for a moment. He lowered his eyes. I won't let her be with anyone else. Lin Yun looked at her outstanding son. No matter how she looked at him, he seemed like the silly son of a landlord. She didn't say anything more. When the babies woke up, she fed them and took them away. Chapter 807. She said worriedly, then Jinrong, she had her concerns. After all, Jinrong was also her nephew. It would be a lie to say that she didn't love him. Tang Yu's voice was a little hurried and bitter. Chi-Chi won't fall in love with anyone else. She had loved him deeply. How could she easily accept someone else? Lin Yun nodded and asked the servants to take the 2 babies back to Zhao Yi. Then, she turned back. There were some things that she couldn't say even in front of Tang Ziyuan. Now that it was only the mother and son, she still said, Tang Yu, you have to be careful. Shenlian is now. She didn't need to say the rest, but Tang Yu already knew. He smiled faintly to show that he understood. Lin Yun went back after giving the instructions. Tang Yu turned around and got into the car, driving all the way back to the rose garden. Although he was very hungry, he was not in the mood to eat. Under the little maid's uneasy gaze, he slowly walked upstairs. Upstairs, he didn't allow servants to come up for more than a year. Everything was taken care of by himself. In the bedroom, it was still the same as when Pei Chi-Chi was there. Their wedding photos were hanging on the wall. Tang Yu sat in the living room, his body deeply sunk into the sofa. Today, he had experienced ecstasy, passion, anger, and helplessness. A small, square robot slid over. It looked ugly and cute. It had a leather appearance, a round face, shoulder-length hair, a small body, and 4 thin legs, but it was very flexible. The little robot slid over and could even plunge into Tang Yu's arms and call him Daddy. Tang Yu's fingers gently stroked the black hair. No one knew that it was Pei Chi-Chi's hair. He cut it with his own hands during the month when she was in a coma. Touching it now was like touching her. Tang Yu's mood improved a little. He lowered his head and picked up the little person, putting it beside him. Shao Qi, you're still the most obedient. Not like your mother. She's so stubborn and often makes my liver hurt. The robot named Little Seven nodded, its round eyes blinking a few times, indicating that it understood. Her program was very simple. Whenever she saw him, she would be easy to get along with. Tang Yu didn't ask anyone to set up her other functions. It was just a simple conversation, as long as she could accompany him. However, this kind of emotional communication was precisely what the highest-end robots possessed, and the number 7S on the market did not have such high-level emotions. 7 leaned on Tang Yu's side obediently. Then, she rested her head on his leg. Tang Yu lowered his head to look at her and smiled. Pei Chi-Chi has a rival in love. He patted her again. Go play by yourself. 7 wasn't willing and was still on his leg. Tang Yu had no choice but to hug her. So clingy, just like your mother. Little Chi-Chi's little hands and feet were wrapped around him. Tang Yu couldn't help but laugh, but he was a little distracted. He thought about what he did to Pei Chi-Chi in the car today. If she hadn't woken up, he would really be worse than a beast today. But he didn't care that much. If he was worse than a beast, then so be it. Downstairs, the little maids gathered together, a little worried. Sir is alone with that robot again. If this goes on for a long time, will there be mental problems? Another one whispered, I think there's already problems now. That's right. Which man of his age doesn't have a woman? Being with a robot like this, will something indescribable happen between them? Chapter 808. Beauty magazine was selling like hotcakes once again, and it was printed 3 more times. The boss of the magazine company counted the money until his hands were sore, and the editor-in-chief was also very proud. Man magazine had always been known as the industry leader, but this time, Beauty magazine simply beat that bullshit magazine that specialized in taking off women's clothes. The editor-in-chief was very happy just thinking about it, so he found Pei Chi-Chi particularly pleasing to the eye and spoke gently. Little Pei, I've already applied for a raise for you and skipped 2 grades. This is a rare thing in our company, so keep up the good work. After saying that, the editor-in-chief changed the topic. This time, I have a special reward for you in Old Kansas. Pei Chi-Chi looked at him eagerly, as if all she could see was the scene of RMB sprinkling down. The editor-in-chief smiled mysteriously. It's a good thing that only happens once in 1,000 years. He took out 2 invitations from the drawer and pushed them in front of Pei Chi-Chi and Old Kansas Celebrity Charity Night. It's pretty cool, isn't it? It's organized by Madame Sue Mo. There are only 2 in the company, so I think it's better to let the meritorious people go. Old Kan took it, looked at the publicity on the back, and grinned. Editor-in-chief, don't tell me that you want us to secretly take photos and write a press release or something. The editor-in-chief's scheme had succeeded, and he smiled contentedly. Old Kan, you really know me. Old Kan really wanted to say, fuck, I don't want to go. He knew that this old guy was obviously playing dirty. The editor-in-chief looked at Pei Chi-Chi with a smile and stretched out a finger. 10,000 yuan for the installation fee. That's enough capital, right? Dress up well and get a headline. Old Kan puffed out a smoke ring and said in a gruff voice, we're making a magazine, and it's printed on paper. What headline? Even if we get the headline, the whole world will know about it when it's printed in about a month. The editor-in-chief could become the editor-in-chief not only because he had foresight, but also because he was shameless and thick-skinned. He was still smiling. Because this issue of the magazine is selling very well, I've specially asked someone to open a Weibo account. Pei Chi-Chi and Old Kan looked at each other, and they had a bad feeling in their hearts. Sure enough, the editor-in-chief said, we'll focus on topics related to Mr. Tang. I guarantee it'll be exclusive. Old Kan spoke first, we're not paparazzi. What do you mean by paparazzi or kitten? It's all photography. Why do you have to make such a clear distinction? The chief editor got up and patted Lao Ken on the shoulder earnestly. The higher-ups attach great importance to this project. We can develop in this direction in the future. This is an act of infringement. Old Kan reminded. He did not believe that the chief editor did not know. Naturally, the chief editor had already thought of this. He smiled sweetly and said, how would these big shots have the time to argue with us about this kind of lawsuit? Don't forget that Xing Yuan has a team of lawyers, Pei Chi-Chi said softly. The editor-in-chief blew his beard and glared at them. In any case, I'll take care of it after this happens. You guys just focus on gathering the information that the fans want. Lao Kan and Pei Chi looked at each other and said nothing. After returning to Old Kan's office, Pei Chi put down the things in her hands and looked at Old Kan with her hands on her hips. What do you say? Old Kan was taking a cigarette. After taking it, he put out the old cigarette butt and replied casually, What do you mean? Are you really going to be a paparazzi? Pei Chi glared at him. Chapter 809. Pei Chi's gaze fell on the invitation card on the table. What about this? Go. Why not? Old Kan flashed his pearly white teeth. Why? Are you still scared? Pei Chi said softly, I'm not scared. Old Kan put his arm around her shoulder. You still have me, don't you? On Saturday night, at the GM Hotel in City B, the celebrity charity night was about to be held. There was a long red carpet in front of the hotel, and on both sides, there were people taking pictures of the celebrities. The host, who was also one of the top celebrities in the country, was explaining the guests at the signing wall on the red carpet. His partner was a newcomer. She was beautiful and pure, and looked like she would become popular soon. As Pei Chi and Old Kan walked on the red carpet, the host recognized Old Kan and said warmly, Let's welcome Old Kan from Jiaren magazine and his little girlfriend. Actually, he had not seen it clearly for a moment, but now that he saw it clearly, it turned out to be Pei Chi. How should he put it? Pei Chi was Tang Yu's ex-wife. Regardless of whether there was anything going on between her and Old Kan, it should not be said out in the open. Moreover, Mr. Tang was also walking on the red carpet with his fiancée, Shen Lian, beside him. The host had made a slip of the tongue, but Old Kan only smiled and did not correct him. Of course, Tang Yu also heard it. His originally expressionless face became even colder. Shen Lian, who was beside him, smiled and said, This doesn't feel good, does it? She was in a good mood today, seeing such a big show the moment she arrived. Moreover, it had been a long time since she saw Pei Chi. It must have been tough on Shen Lian. She could actually walk like a normal person with a prosthetic leg and a pair of high heels. She held Tang Yu's arm and walked towards Pei Chi with a victorious smile on her face. She wanted to see Pei Chi's expression of wanting to cry. She wanted to tell Pei Chi that Tang Yu was now hers. However, she was still thinking too much. When he reached the end of the red carpet, Tang Yu did not stop. Instead, he walked straight to the banquet hall. Shen Lian stood there alone. Her delicate face that was raised high had some cracks. She just signed her name, smiled, and let the reporters take a few photos. She didn't even look at Pei Chi. This reminded Pei Chi of the first time she met Shen Lian. She looked at her as if she was looking at a lowly creature. Pei Chi looked down and smiled. As long as Shen Lian was happy. There's no problem, right? Lao Kan looked at Pei Chi. Pei Chi shook her head and entered the banquet hall with Lao Kan. Lao Kan carefully helped her carry the silver gown. It was a wraparound design. He really couldn't tell that this girl was actually quite stylish in this dress. Needless to say, she was pretty. Pei Chi had always been a little fairy. She was so much better than that white lotus from earlier. It was quite lively tonight. Lao Kan and Pei Chi were just about to enter when another pair of enemies appeared. Qin Anlin and the recently popular Pei Huan. Qin Anlin's gaze was indifferent, and Pei Huan looked innocent. Of course, Pei Chi remembered the scene 2 years ago when they were working in the office. However, she wouldn't tell Lao Kan about this. Qin Anlin walked closer and slowed down his pace. After a long time, he finally approached and looked at Pei Chi. You're finally willing to come back. Lao Kan listened at the side. This wasn't right. Why did it sound a little ambiguous? He looked at Pei Chi and then at Qin Anlan's passionate eyes. He was sure that this man was also one of Pei Chi's men. Who had his disciple offended in the past? CEO of Xingyuan, CEO of Lin Corporation, CEO of King Entertainment. All of them were not to be trifled with. Old Can touched his nose. He did not admit or deny it. Pei Chi asked casually. She did not expect to get to the point. She looked at Old Can and was really impressed by him. It was many years ago. She and I were young back then, and we just played together. Old Can said uncomfortably, back then, everyone was in a difficult situation. There was a lot of pressure. He then glared at Pei Chi and said, "Why are you asking this, you little brat?" Chapter 8:11. Since it was a charity night, there would naturally be an auction. Pei Chi and Old Can were just there to watch. The rules tonight were a little perverted. They couldn't participate in the auction of the items they donated. If they wanted to get it back, they would have to rely on their male and female partners to raise their placards. Because of this game, the crowd was very lively. It was a game that rich people liked to play. Pei Chi stood beside Old Can and turned her head. "Master, she's the most capable one among all your women." She was referring to Su Mo. It was obvious that Su Mo was very popular. Old Can chuckled and said something meaningful, "She's quite capable. She's popular with both young and old." There was a lot of information in his words. She didn't say anything else as she looked at the stage. Su Mo, the fashion legend. Pei Chi guessed that the woman who hurt Old Can was Su Mo. Su Mo stood on the stage, radiant. She looked at Old Can again. There was an unfathomable depth in his eyes. Pei Chi couldn't help but touch his arm, trying to coax him. "It's okay, master. You still have me." Old Can's heart warmed. He was actually touched, but he didn't seem to mind. "What's the use of having you?" Pei Chi pouted and turned her face away to ignore him, expressing her anger. Their interaction was very sweet in the eyes of outsiders. From afar, Shen Lian raised her cup and looked over there before looking at Tang Yu. She smiled faintly and said, "You must feel bad, right?" Tang Yu had always ignored her strange and provocative words. Shen Lian was snubbed. Then, she remembered something important. "Help me bid for the items that I'm donating later." Tang Yu naturally would. He would give her face on the surface. Even if it was in front of Chi, he didn't know if she would be unhappy or jealous. Shen Lian was very scheming. She had donated a diamond ring. If Tang Yu were to fight for it, everyone would think that it was a marriage proposal in disguise. Tang Yu was also stunned when he saw the diamond ring. The 60-carat perfect diamond ring shone especially brightly on the stage. Shen Lian's desire to get married was clear as day. Su Mo was also on the stage. As a woman, she was a little envious when she saw the shiny diamond ring. This diamond ring was worth at least 10 million. It wasn't something that ordinary people could afford. The male host was used to big scenes, so he performed steadily. "This is a diamond ring donated by President Shen. President Shen is very generous." Then, the live aperture captured Tang Yu, and the host said excitedly, "We look forward to seeing Mr. Tang." Shen Lian, on the other hand, was extremely shy. Everything was under her control. On such an occasion, there was no way Tang Yu wouldn't give her face. When he put on the diamond ring for her, she would let the mainstream media publish all kinds of articles. She didn't believe that Tang Yu could withstand the pressure. Chapter 8:12. I think President Shen is reminding me that I owe her a ring. Tang Yu's voice was magnetic and touching. All the women present put their palms together and were excited by the beautiful scene. Of course, Pei Chi was the exception. She watched indifferently as Shen Lian put on a show. She had been waiting for this day for a long time. At that moment, Tang Yu's gaze swept across the audience and paused on Pei Chi for 2 seconds. His gaze was firm and gentle, just like how he used to look at her in the past. Pei Chi's gaze was clear and cold, but he quickly shifted his gaze away. Tang Yu held the microphone and said in a clear voice, "Unfortunately, an accident happened when President Shen and I were engaged. So, this ring can be considered a diamond ring to make up for that day." Shen Lian was stunned. She did not expect Tang Yu to say that. It sounded dignified, but that was not the case. Which woman would want to be engaged when she was almost 30? When the camera pointed at her, she forced a smile and stood up. "I'm very happy that Mr. Tang has such awareness." Su Mo smiled sweetly on the stage. Happy? No woman would be happy when her fiancé deliberately went astray when her hints were so obvious, right? Su Mo looked at Pei Chi, who was standing next to Lao Kansas. It seemed that it was almost impossible for Shen Lian to marry Tang Yu. No matter how disappointed Shen Lian was, she still walked up to the stage and accepted the ring. Although Tang Yu put it on for her, she still could not feel happy. There was a huge difference between a wedding ring and an engagement ring. At that moment, Su Mo said teasingly, "Mr. Tang and Miss Shen are so lovey-dovey. But I'm curious about one thing. Mr. Tang calls Miss Shen President Shen and Miss Shen calls him Mr. Tang. I don't know if their relationship is not harmonious or if there's a special meaning. Can you share with me?" Shen Lian smiled. "Tang Yu doesn't want others to know about this private matter." "Mr. Shen, you're really good at Tai Chi." Su Mo was already at the same level as the White Bone Demon. She turned to Tang Yu and asked, "Mr. Tang, do you have anything interesting to share with Mr. Shen?" Tang Yu smiled faintly. "Miss Su wants to know." Su Mo's heart skipped a beat when she saw such a handsome man staring at her. Tang Yu smiled. "If you want to know, we can have a drink later." This was blatant teasing, and he did not give Shen Lian any face at all. The sparkling diamond ring had dimmed a little. It turned out that this pair of fiancé and fiancée were not that loving. Tang Yu had even openly developed a relationship outside. Shen Lian was furious, but standing on the stage, she had to squeeze out a smile and pretend to be indifferent. She knew that this was a warning from Tang Yu. She had angered him tonight. Su Mo's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly calmed down. Seriously, she was almost 40 years old, yet she was still being teased by a man who was not even 30. It was too embarrassing. Su Mo covered her face. "Mr. Tang, will Mr. Shen be unhappy about this?" Tang Yu glanced at Shen Lian and said meaningfully, "We respect each other." Oh, respect each other meant that they would play their own games. Shen Lian was very embarrassed, but she could not flare up. She could only force a smile and get off the stage. On the other side, Su Mo did not let Tang Yu go. She tilted her head and looked at him. "I wonder what kind of charity you're donating tonight, Mr. Tang." Tang Yu smiled faintly, and his whole body was warm. "A humble painting that I drew myself." You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.